Good morning, everyone. My name is Alexa Uda. I'm a demographics reporter here at the Texas Tribune. And on behalf of everyone here, I'm delighted to welcome you to the 8th Annual Texas Tribune Festival. I'm so excited there are so many people here to talk about census at 8 a.m. I didn't think we'd fill the room. We are here. This panel is presented by the Annie E. Casey Foundation. The corporate sponsors and donors underwrite this event. They play no role in determining the panel's contents, panelists, or line of questioning. We're here to talk about the census. We've got a great panel lined up, counting every Texan. Before I introduce our great panelists, a couple of quick housekeeping things. We're going to have about an hour here. We'll do 40 to 45 minutes of conversation on stage, and then we'll open it up to questions from y'all. So please have those ready. I'll give you a heads up when we're getting close to that portion. If you are going to tweet, please use the hashtag TribFest18, but please silence your phones in the meantime just so we have no interruptions. And with all of that settled, we will go ahead and get started. Here to my left is Cathy Lacy. She is the Regional Director of the U.S. Census Bureau, a position she's been in since 2007. As Regional Director, she's responsible for overseeing administration and public relations for the Bureau in 12 states, including Texas. Next to her is Michael Lee, who serves as Senior Counsel for the Brennan Center's Democracy Program, where he focuses on redistricting, voting rights, and elections. If you pay any attention to redistricting news out of Texas, you know he is a go-to person, given his expertise on the fight for representation in the nation and in Texas. Next to him is State Representative César Blanco, who has represented the El Paso area in the Texas House since 2015. He is a veteran of both Congress and the U.S. Navy, and he's been among the loudest legislative voices calling for the need for an accurate census. And last but certainly not least, we have Dr. Steve Murdock, who is the former state demographer and former director of the U.S. Census Bureau, a position he served in during the Bush administration. He is currently a sociology professor and a director of the Hobby Center for the Study of Texas at Rice University. Let's give him a round of applause. Thank you all for being here. Our panel is called Counting Every Texan, but we're on the horizon of a national census that many are worried won't actually count every person living in our country and in our state. Between funding concerns and the proposal to tack on a question about citizenship to the questionnaire, there are serious concerns that this won't actually be an accurate census. The stakes are incredibly high for a state like Texas, with billions of federal dollars on the line for road construction, low-income housing, medical assistance, as well as representation in Congress and at the local level. And so I wanted to open up our conversation by asking y'all to provide a little bit more context. You know, a year and a half out from the count, has the environment surrounding the census felt either so uncertain or so politicized as it does right now? Maybe we'll start with Cathy.
Well, I can tell you there's a heightened awareness about the census, which in some ways is a good thing because people are actually thinking about it, and they're thinking about it early. It does give us the opportunity to talk about, one, we know that the census is very important. It's very important that every Texan be counted because they will be represented with congressional representatives as well as part of the $675 billion that are distributed in federal funds each year is distributed based on that population count. So we want to make sure everyone is counted. And I think people are starting to ask questions, which is really good. Our success is Texas's success in opening the doors to those gatekeepers, to the local population that might be fearful to participate in the census, to start talking about it now when they get that invitation to participate in the census. It's not a surprise. It's like, oh, this is important.
Michael, have you ever sensed this? Obviously, you watch the census for redistricting purposes.
You know, I don't think that you've ever seen like this much awareness around the census, right? I mean, in like even in the work that we do, like, you know, there's a group of people who care about the census and will work to get out the census count and do all of that. But there is a real sense with the addition of the citizenship question, which we can talk about in a minute. You know, that this has become a really politicized process, and already I think you're seeing in the states and some of the testing and a fear, and particularly in some communities, about participating in the census, and that's in part driven by the politics of the nation. And I think I think, could there be, I think there's a real concern among a lot of people that there will be an undercount, but a disproportionate undercount in certain communities, and those communities happen to be very large communities in Texas, right? And so I think it's a really fraught time, and and where this all ends up, I think is an open question.
Good morning. I agree. I think the census at the very basic level, it's a fundamental thing that our country does. It's a constitutional responsibility, and unfortunately, it's become a very political topic. This is not a Republican or Democratic issue. This is a U.S. issue that we should be focusing without any kind of partisanship. And unfortunately, this administration has created a political environment where the DOJ and the Department of Commerce is requesting that there's a citizenship question. I'm from a border community. I represent many immigrants in my community. I don't represent, I represent everyone, whether they're a citizen or not. And it's important to note that, because that's what it says in the Constitution. So unfortunately, it has been politicized, and Texas could lose because of it.
Dr. Murdock, you've obviously got the most institutional knowledge with the folks up here.
Yeah, I think one thing to know is that in general, particularly people who were Census Bureau directors, think it's a big mistake to include the citizenship question. We sent a letter to the Secretary of Commerce, we being 6 former directors of the Census Bureau, saying this is a bad idea. We were given a response which was basically, yes, that's none of your business anymore. Well, I was a little less caustic than that, but pretty much. And I think all of us are looking at particularly the question on citizenship, and knowing that many communities in Texas, many communities across the country, particularly that are in those tiers that are affected by immigration to a great extent, there's a great deal of concern. People are not going to go and answer a census when they feel like it could end up causing them to be deported. At the same time, they're going to be there, if they don't answer that, and using services. So that it's a situation where not getting the count doesn't just have a potential negative effect on the immigrants themselves. It has a tremendous effect on how much money you're going to get from various programs if you're a city or a county, etc. It was not well tested. It was not well examined in terms of lots of different factors. Normally would take a year or two to do, were done in a short period of time. And I think that one of the things that all of us that, like me, I've got a meeting I'm going up to in which we've got to reinvigorate people to think it's worthwhile to try to help the census, because they're feeling right now that maybe nobody cares if we don't count certain people, and that trust is a key thing for a thing like the census.
Cathy, where does that leave folks like you? Obviously, you are on the ground trying to get prepared for this count, and there is both fear in the community given the rhetoric regarding immigration that's sort of bubbled up more loudly a little bit more recently. But then you've also have to convince folks that this is safe. And you have folks like Dr. Murdock saying that this is going to lead to an undercount, or that at a minimum we're risking an undercount. Where does that leave you? How do you prepare to turn around and tell folks this is okay, even if you've got top folks saying that this might inevitably lead to an undercount?
It definitely, we are the implementation arm of the Census Bureau, census, as far as our 6 regional offices, and it does make our job more challenging. What it does, we've actually been out working in the community earlier than we did last census. When we're talking about the border areas, we actually were down there talking to some of the communities that had felt that they were undercounted, why they felt they were undercounted, and we talked about what are some of the solutions. And what we looked at, it was a community-driven dialogue that we worked with one of the colleges to create. And what we were looking for is what is the message that resonates? Understanding what the problem is. So So what we can say is every census employee takes an oath of office. And what it is it says that I, Cathy Lacy, the U.S. Census Bureau, cannot release any of the information that I collect. And I could be imprisoned up to 5 years or fined $250,000. That's the same oath that every census employee or contractor takes when you deal with census data. And I think it's important to note that we actually collect less information than a credit card application. And because we are collecting the census through an electronic format this time, we've actually increased the confidentiality of the information that we collect. No one person has much information about anybody. Even when if people choose not to respond through one of our 3 methods, which is responding through the internet, calling and completing their census questionnaire over the phone, or mailing back a questionnaire when it comes to their home. Even people that we hire to follow up on those households that did not respond, everything is encrypted. So they actually don't have an opportunity to breach much of anything, because once they collect that information, it's encrypted and it's taken off of their devices. So we've increased the safety and security of the data that we're collecting.
What is, Representative Blanco, I'm curious, when you hear that sort of assurance, how does that actually play out on the ground, though? When you have communities that are multi-generational immigrant communities, you might have folks who are undocumented, you might have folks who are legal permanent residents with relatives who are undocumented, or citizens with relatives who are undocumented. As far as what you're hearing on the ground now, is that actually reassuring to folks?
Not necessarily. I mean, the community looks at what this administration has done, and when you see things like the Muslim ban, you see things like family separation, you see things in states like Texas that have passed laws like SB4, the Show Me Your Papers bill. You're not going to have any confidence or trust for what could potentially happen. So people in my community, whether they're citizen or non-citizen, really don't trust the government in general. So it doesn't matter how much the census is doing out there to gain trust and to communicate. We're set up in a political environment to fail. And that's because this administration has taken horrible policies and implemented them, and not only the federal government, but so has the state.
I want to ask about the reasoning for the citizenship question that could affect the census. The stated purpose originally was because it would help with better enforcement of the Voting Rights Act. Obviously, there's ongoing litigation through which there have been memos and documents that have surfaced that indicate that that might not have actually been the reasoning or the way the timeline was set up. And Michael, I'm wondering if you can sort of walk us through, from a redistricting standpoint, do you really need this data to do this the right way?
So you do need citizenship data to comply with the Voting Rights Act, but the reality is everyone who litigates these cases will tell you that we already have that data, and through a survey called the American Community Survey, which is done every year, and that data works fine. You know, experts work with it, they finesse it, and there's absolutely no reason that we need an additional source of data. And in fact, although originally it was reported that the Justice Department had requested the addition of a citizenship question for this reason, as it's turned out, it really was the Commerce Department and Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross who asked the Justice Department to request this information very early on in the Trump administration, like I think February 2017, and a few months later he was emailing saying, why hasn't anybody done anything to my request? DOJ said in some emails, like, we're in the middle of this Comey situation, we don't really want to sort of step into this. But that just really shows you how pretextual it is, right? I mean, this was, like, DOJ really didn't ask for it. Civil rights litigators who litigate these cases day in and day out didn't ask for it. Everybody will tell you we already have enough information, in fact, more reliable information, right? Because a census occurs one day or 1 point every decade, right? The American Community Survey is a much more robust set of data because it's done every year. It's a sample, but you combine, there's a 5-year average. And so as communities change over a period of time, you actually have much better citizenship data with that. And of course, like, if you add a citizenship question on the survey that goes to everybody, which hasn't been asked since 1950, and it depresses response rates, then the citizenship data is actually worse, right? And so I will say the one thing that I think that this does get at, which is perhaps the ultimate aim of this, right? It's not really the Voting Rights Act. It is to change the way that districts are drawn in the country so that you don't equalize the total number of people. Right now, every district has to have the same number of people. There could be a movement to change that so that districts have the same number of citizens or the same number of eligible voters, and that data would help in that effort. That hasn't happened yet, but I fully expect that some states or localities will attempt to do that, perhaps even the Texas legislature here.
Dr. Murdock, has there ever been a conversation like this during your time on the Bureau or affiliated with the Bureau in which this was discussed seriously?
Well, I don't remember all of the discussions, but certainly in the ones that I've been most active, we've avoided that issue for the very reason that we think it'll suppress response to the census, and it'll frankly repress the response in areas that are most in need of a good count for a whole set of services that they want to deliver and that they will or can obtain some federal assistance for. So it's I've never seen this particular device used in terms of a citizenship question. People have avoided that, and analysts have looked at this. As I was talking to somebody earlier, a group of us that got together, former directors, and gave a very strong thing to the Census Bureau, said, this is a mistake. You should not do this. And we were summarily ignored like everyone else has on this question. And then, that's really not a fault of the Census Bureau as such. It's coming from a higher level. But it is going to cause areas that are most in need of resources. They're going to be some of the areas that will be most impacted because of people's fear of the citizenship question. And that, I think, is a really unfortunate thing for the people of Texas, the people of other states. All our states, of course, have people who are in need. But certainly states like Texas, California are large Hispanic states.
And just to add to that, 2 counties in Texas that were severely undercounted was my home county, El Paso County, and Hidalgo County. And the border region in general already has its challenges. We've got a lot of colonias that are hard to count. Many addresses are hard to find. Homes are dispersed. Then you have the language barrier as well. So already it's difficult to count these communities just based on the environment. Add another layer of fear, it's going to be really hard to get into these communities and to make an accurate count. So we're doing everything that we can at the local level. I'll give you an example. I've convened meetings with the city and the county in El Paso County to see if we can create a El Paso Complete Count Committee and put money into it within their city budget, with the counties. There are things that local governments and state governments can do to supplement what we believe is an underfunded census to execute this job in order for us to get our fair share. So those are some of the things. But already, just to go out there and count these communities is already has its inherent set of difficulties. But now the citizenship question is just making this even worse.
Could I just add to that?
Absolutely.
A lot of people will hear these concerns and think like, well, this affects Latinos, right? And this is a Democratic Republican issue, right? This will hurt Democrats, right? But the reality is that an undercount hurts all of Texas, right? Because for one thing, Texas is projected right now to gain 3 to 4 congressional seats. It may not gain those seats, but even beyond that, take Dallas County, for example, where I used to live. There are lots of Republican-held districts in Dallas County that have a lot of Latinos, right? And right now, it benefits Republicans because you essentially have districts that have a lot of filler Latinos who don't vote because they're children or because they're non-citizens. If you have an undercount, Dallas County could lose representation because of the way that districts are allocated to counties. And if that happens, it's not going to be a Democratic seat that goes away. It's going to be potentially a Republican seat that goes away in places like Dallas County. So this is an issue that is not a D's versus R's issue, even though many people will hear Latinos and many people will put on their partisan hats and think, well, that's bad for Democrats and good for us, right? But that's not actually the case.
And on that, just, having worked in Congress for many years, it's a numbers game. When you have more members of Congress advocating for your state through the budget process, through legislation, BRAC, things that are important to our economy, you need more boots on the ground, roaming around the halls of Congress advocating for your state. I think it was the governor. I may have it wrong, but in California, they've got their stuff together. And they're quoted, I don't know where the news outlet was, but they said they'd love to pick up one of Texas' seats. So, California has moved $90 million for a statewide complete count committee, and Texas has done zero.
I want to talk about a statewide complete count committee, but before we get there, obviously, Representative Blanco, you've said this is not a Democrat issue, this is not a Republican issue. And yet, at least since the citizenship question was announced, the census has emerged as a sort of political fault line in Texas, where you've seen mostly Democrats speak out loudly and say we need an accurate count. And the few Republicans who I have seen talking on the record about it have done so to say that they do like the citizenship question. I'm thinking of Attorney General Ken Paxton and Senator Ted Cruz. Obviously, we don't have a Republican on stage. I will acknowledge that. But I'm curious, when you're working in a state like Texas, where the rhetoric regarding immigration weighs so heavily on the day-to-day debate, how do you even approach doing an accurate count and getting everyone on board when the positioning from the get-go seems to be so partisan on an issue that really could affect both parties?
It's really going back to what the representative talked about before. Those characteristics that makes an area hard to count, when we talk about the border, they have all those characteristics. You've got individuals that language, hopefully English is a second language, but in many it's only Spanish. So you've got a communication divide right there. You've got areas of the population in the colonias where they are lower income. The education level is lower in some cases, and you've got a lot of mobility. So you've got all those factors that make that population hard to count anyway. So that is what we're focusing on. Whenever we go to a congressman's office, we talk about the challenges that we've had in previous censuses, and we talk about the challenges for this census. The fact that with each census, things do get a little bit more difficult. When we look at just response rates alone on our current surveys, we've really seen a decline in response rates. And granted, they're not mandatory like the census is, but still it gives us an idea of the challenges that we're going to have to face when we start actually conducting the census. So that's why this effort, and I love hearing about the local complete count committees, because that's the success of what we're doing. Communities have to be involved in this census, and they have to be involved at a lower level. When we start hiring, and we want to hire neighbors to enumerate neighbors, that's critical to our success. You need to hire people locally who understand the culture and who speak the language in order for us to help to bridge that trust gap. So many of the things that we've done before, we will be doing again, except we've started earlier in trying to bridge some of that gaps in education and outreach.
So let's talk about what the state can do. Beyond these local state complete count committees, there's obviously been a conversation about, do we engage in a statewide complete count committee? As far as I know, that did not happen during the Rick Perry administration and the census that occurred during that time. I've been told there are some early conversations about getting one in Texas. I know, Representative Blanco, you've talked about even legislation. And I'm curious, this isn't actually something that requires legislation, though, right? This could start from the governor's office.
Right, and there's precedent. I mean, again, it's not a Republican or Democratic issue. There's precedent with Governor Clements, precedent with Governor Bush, who issued executive orders to ensure that Secretary of State promote the census, to ensure that the state is doing everything it can to work with the U.S. Census to get the information out there. And we're seeing states throughout the country putting a budget behind the census count. We saw New Mexico's doing it, New Jersey, New York, a lot of states are doing it. We can do the same. Just to give you a sense, I mean, $43 billion are on the table. That's what we use in Texas as census-directed funds. You had mentioned earlier, highways, early education, CHIP. Those are examples of how that can help us as a state improve our infrastructure and become competitive. The business community looks very closely at census data. There are the chambers of commerce in Houston, a dependent op-ed, saying that data is important to make business decisions. You don't put your finger up in the air and test the wind and say, okay, we're going to invest in this community or bring jobs to this community. They need to understand the demographics, the age, the educational attainment levels for those communities in order to invest. So what I've done is, as soon as Secretary Ross came out supporting this citizenship question, we called a conference with a group of stakeholders, including the CCCCC, MALDEF, NALEO, to bring awareness to the situation. Since then, as chair of the Texas House Border Caucus, we've sent a letter to Governor Abbott requesting that he create a statewide complete count committee. We haven't heard from the governor yet on this issue. We are going to work, as you all know, the LBB is currently figuring out its base budget. We're requesting that funds be included or there be funds allocated within the budget to help create a complete count committee. If the LBB fails to do that, I'm going to offer a budget writer to make sure that we include funding in our state for a complete count committee. If that doesn't work, I'm going to file legislation to authorize the state to create a complete count committee. At the very basic level, we can start in our local communities again and create those. If the state does not step up to the plate, we can rely on our local counties and cities to put in some funding to do that. But again, it's a group effort from the federal down to the local level. We got to make sure that Texas doesn't leave money on the table in order for us to continue to be competitive nationally.
I think one of the things to realize is that we've had this phenomenal growth, outdistancing everyone, so that both Dallas area and the Houston area had greater population growth with 7 or 8 million, depending on who you believe, versus L.A. and New York. We had greater growth in those two cities than those larger cities from other states have had. So we're growing and growing very, very rapidly. So that if you're going to do this kind of thing that you're talking about, Texas is particularly important for a good count, not only for Texas, but for the country. And the Austin area, for example, has grown phenomenally. And and it's kind of funny because in percentage terms, when they show the tables, they have this little place that's like 250 people. It's got the largest percentage increase. But then it's the city, this city that has added more people than anybody thought we would have. And so what I'm trying to get at is the need is especially important. It's especially large in Texas. And we need to do everything we can to ensure that we have the ability to adequately count those people, because they're going to be using services, they're going to be doing various things, and we need to make sure that Texas gets a complete count.
But we're in a state where the debate over immigration looms more actively over day-to-day debates than if you were in Montana.
Sure.
And are we really, and I've heard from census officials, it helps to have the top elected official in each community saying, this is okay, you should do this, you can trust this, whether it's a mayor or a county judge or at the statewide level, a governor. But are we really living in a world where we expect the governor to turn around and tell undocumented immigrants living in the state, please do this, you can trust this? I mean, is that the end goal here?
I think that is an end goal. And the other thing that is an end goal, which previous comments, you know, it's a concern. It's those gatekeepers for those local communities. A census, it's all about the local community. Yes, we do it nationwide, but it's about the local community, and it's about the pastor or the priest that they hear on Sunday. It's about that health worker that might be helping them with a situation. It's talking to those individuals about the security of the data, and that we cannot release the information that we collect only in statistical format, and only if it does not identify one individual or household. It doesn't identify a household. So when we release the information, we're not releasing individual information. That's not going to be released for 70 years unless they ask for their individual information. So we're not going to be releasing that information. And we do have to make those people in the local community aware of that, so that when they do if they go online, and I do say the safest way for households to respond for this census is to simply go online. Why? Because the census is not finished until I have something for every household in the state of Texas. So if there are households that we do not have anything back for that household, that's when we hire a group of people to go to that local community and collect that information. So they will have someone coming to their door if they don't respond otherwise. So that's why we say, as far as increasing the safety of their data, go online, complete it. You don't even have to deal with me.
All right. Go ahead. I do think, like, you know, we've talked a lot about, I mean, extra engagement is really important this census, because this census will be very different than other censuses, even if there isn't a citizenship question. There's litigation ongoing now that may get that question struck down. But the census will be mostly online for the first time, which is brand new. You know, and the Census Bureau has consistently been underfunded. Now that's increased a bit more recently, but you know, so there are lots of challenges, and I think, you know, we can't count on the government filling all of this, right? I do think, like, there needs to be adequate funding for community groups and others to get the message out, because even if there isn't a citizenship question, and I worry that the damage has already been done, like, even if there is no citizenship question, everybody will think that there is a citizenship question, right? And they will say, I don't trust this. Some people may be untrustworthy about doing things online, right? Because we've had, like, election hacking and all of this, right? And so, you know, there needs to be a lot of education about all of the fact that A, it's online, but B, like, you know, you can trust the security. We have, like, really good security and all of that. And it can't just be done through the government, because I worry that that isn't enough.
Mm-hmm. You know, I feel bad for census employees. I'm going to say a prayer for you all every single night, because you all have such an important job, and you're dealing with an unusual environment. Mm-hmm. But to your point about trust, that's been violated. The people do not trust this government. With Muslim bans, with DACA being dissolved, with family separation, with these hateful immigration policies, it doesn't matter what the census does. Even at the state level with SB4, the Show Me Your Papers bill. Even at that level, like, no matter what it does, we are in a political environment where people do not trust somebody knocking on their door with a clipboard or an iPad to say, don't worry, your information won't be released, when we're seeing ICE raids, when we're seeing even veterans being deported. The trust has been violated. So it's unfortunate that we're going through this census in this environment. What I think should happen is that, you know, elections matter. I think we get a new Congress. Maybe they can move funding, although it might be too late to move an adequate budget for census. We need an administration that's going to re-engage the community, that demonstrates that, you know, make your voices heard, be counted. Trust us. We're not going to give your information to any agency that's going to come knock on your door the next day to deport you. So we can do as much as we can, but as long as this administration continues with its hateful policies, people aren't going to answer the door.
I want to talk about this adding on to this environment that we're living in. You know, I think I obviously am a nerd about people being accurately counted by the government. And you see it in redistricting debates, and you see it when folks are trying to get money for their districts up at the Capitol. But Dr. Murdock, you've given sort of this chat for like 20 years to state officials about this is what our state is.
Try 40. I was 10 when I started, of course.
But you've told them this is what our state is going to look like. These are the needs. This is what the data is telling us. This is what the data could eventually tell us based on these estimates or projections. And yet we continue to live in an environment in which both just generally from a census standpoint, and then more specifically in redistricting, where there seems to be almost sort of a veil of ignorance sometimes about how much we actually do rely on the accurate count of data, including of undocumented immigrants, where really our count in Congress depends in large part, or in some part, on counting undocumented immigrants here. Do you feel that this tension, though, is this new? I mean, or is this something that's been around as politics have shifted?
Well, there's always been some tension, but not at the level I'm seeing it now. I'm seeing people simply, I've had people come up to me that know about my past life, and they'll say, well, what do you think? Can I go ahead and answer that question, census form? And I give them the standard census, well, they have confidentiality and so forth and so on. But the general political atmosphere in the state has created a situation where they don't believe me. People that they used to say, well, if you say it that way, and I was in the bureaucracy of the state, so to speak, do not do that anymore, because they feel there's a federal source that is the ultimate source, the guiding source, so to speak, and that they're going to make that decision. So it's very hard to get someone who's got a lot at stake, and I mean deportation or et cetera, to say, oh, well, if that guy says it's right, I'm just going to go ahead and fill out my form. That's just not, I don't think, not going to happen. I wish it wasn't that way, but we've created, in part, we meaning the federal government and others, we have created an atmosphere that is very difficult for people who are trying to make their way in this country.
I want to talk about the debate over who deserves representation and how closely tied that is to the census and an accurate count. Michael, you mentioned, obviously, alluded to a lawsuit from a couple of years ago out of Texas that went all the way to the Supreme Court based on a challenge that legislative districts should be drawn based on the number of eligible voters and not total population. Obviously, that affects areas where you have a lot of children and where you have a lot of non-citizens. Eventually, the court ruled that the way Texas was doing this was sort of the standard, but they didn't necessarily rule that it would be unconstitutional to do this from an eligible voter standpoint. Looking back on this lawsuit, it was a sort of wacky situation in which the state's attorney general, Ken Paxton, actually sided with the Democratic lawmakers who were saying, let's keep doing it the way we're doing, which I think is in part a reflection of the way Texas does benefit from doing this by total population, given how much of our population are children and non-citizens. But I'm wondering, now in this world where the Attorney General has said he does approve of the citizenship question, looking back on this now, was this sort of a precursor to where we are now? And if we do end up getting the citizenship data, what are your bets on whether we do actually get not just a lawsuit challenging the system, but actual legislation out of the Capitol?
Well, so the Supreme Court a couple of years ago heard a case called Evanwell versus Abbott, where the question was whether states had to draw districts to balance the number of eligible voters rather than the number of total people. And the Supreme Court, in an opinion, said, no, what Texas is doing is fine, but we will leave open for another day whether a state could voluntarily choose to do eligible voters or perhaps citizens. And that other day may be coming fairly soon. There was an effort in Missouri to do exactly that this last spring. It failed narrowly. It passed one house, and then just they ran out of time. They didn't pass the other house, but we're fully expecting efforts in a number of states, whether it's Arizona or Texas perhaps, to do exactly that, to say like we should have the same number of citizens or the same number of voters. And at some level, that seems like really fair to people, right? You know, districts should have the same number of voters, right? And after all, the principle is called one person, one vote, somewhat confusingly. But when you go back to the reasons why we have representation, why we fought the revolution, for example, no taxation without representation. It wasn't. It was about the idea that everybody got representation, and we always have represented people, whether or not they could vote. So women got representation. And were counted for purposes of representation, even when women couldn't vote. Children to this day get representation or are counted for in representation, even though they can't vote, and the same thing for non-citizens. And so, you know, there's a lot of history that suggests why, you know, that you know, voting is one thing, and then there's also representation. And if you sort of change the apportionment base, you really are doing a number of things. I mean, you're making it harder for some people who have a lot of children or immigrants to represent people, because the total number of people will be bigger in their district. But you're also potentially shifting power out of urban and suburban areas toward rural areas. And that has huge political consequences. And so there's lots of reasons why nobody should do this, which is not to say that somebody won't try to do this, right? We live, as you pointed out, in a very politicized environment where, like, going after immigrants or, like, trying to target certain groups is very popular, or perhaps even politically savvy. And so, you know, I think a lot of people, both locally and nationally, are worried that there will be an effort in some state to bring this issue back up to the Supreme Court and get the Supreme Court to say, yes, it will be fined if you've chosen to do citizens, you've chosen to do eligible voters rather than total population, and have the Supreme Court say, we left that issue open in Evanwell versus Abbott. Now we're saying that's okay if you choose to do that. And of course, needless to say, it will be a very different Supreme Court than the Supreme Court that heard the case a couple of years ago. And so this is a coming battle, and it may well be, you know, a lot of great redistricting and voting rights litigation comes out of Texas. This may be Texas's next starring role. So,
we're close to running out of time before we open this up to questions from the audience. So I wanted to close by, we've obviously taken sort of a 10,000-foot view on a lot of these issues. But Dr. Murdock, when we talked last week, you mentioned this example of the director of a food pantry. And this director looks at census data. She thinks about the number of folks she is going to have to serve, probably bases it off in part from this data, and then goes on to serve those folks. If we're in the environment in which it is almost guaranteed by some perspectives that we're going to have an undercount, what is the message to that food pantry director when the time comes that there are actually more people knocking on her door for help? What do we leave folks with, knowing, you know, after this sort of depressing conversation,
Yeah.
what is the message to the food pantry director?
I don't know what the message is that'll be comforting to that person. They'll have people that need their assistance, that need the products that they have. And if they're being funded for it by even private groups on the basis of census data, if census data isn't accurate, they're going to be saying, you know, I don't have enough resources here to provide the food that these people need. And that's the kind of tragic thing you see if you don't have a good count. And a good count depends in this country on the residents of the states and the counties and the cities and the country as a whole being counted accurately. And if you put things in questions that, you know, push me away from that form, I'm not going to come back and fill out all the rest. I'm just going to say, oh, wait a minute, I don't think I better be counted because they're going to come after me. They're going to do something else. So I think it's really, really important that all of us, to the extent we can, make our voices heard. That this may be good under some ideas, but in terms of an accurate count of people to use for everything that we do, it's a mistake. And it's going to be a mistake that's going to cost states like Texas, California, the most, because we have the largest populations to lose.
Cathy, did you want to add anything on to that?
I mean, you've heard from experts. I mean, we have a very challenging job ahead of us. And The only thing we can do is to work with that local community to build that trust. The Census Bureau has always been based on the trust from the communities, trust in the data that we provide and trust that we protect that data, because without that, our reputation is gone. That is the #1 priority for myself as well as the other 5 regional directors who will oversee the data collection for this census. That's our commitment, and I hear the concerns, and we have a huge job ahead of us.
Well, with that, we will go ahead and open this up to questions from the audience. We'll start right up here. I will ask you that please make sure your question ends with a question mark. I really don't want to have to cut anything off, but I will if I have to. Go ahead.
My question is, can you omit answering a question? Could there be a boycott of that particular question that people like me, who it doesn't affect me in terms of my citizenship, but I could boycott as a part of a movement to not answer that question? I understand if you do it online, it probably won't let you go further, or it won't let you submit until you go back and answer that question. But do you have to answer every question that's in the census, or can you answer the ones you're comfortable with and move on?
So the way we've always done the census, and this is complicated with the fact that we have an internet questionnaire, when we've gone to the door, you could not answer a question. Now what happens later is when we go back to do the edit of the questionnaire, is that one that's going to fall into a review that we have to go back to that housing unit. So I assume the same will be true for an internet response as well.
So I should also say, it's not clear that there will be a citizenship question at this juncture. There are 6 lawsuits pending around the country, including 2 that will go to trial in New York in November and a couple in California in January. So it's not clear that there will be a citizenship question. So people shouldn't quite panic yet, other than some of the messaging damage may have already been done.
Got one back. We'll go back there and then come back.
Sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry. You've got the mic. You go ahead first. I am sorry.
I have a question concerning documenting the homeless population. We touched a little bit about how to reach these communities, but as an extremely mobile population, do you have any recommendations for local entities documenting these folks who often need the most resources?
Okay, so we actually have a few different ways that we have to work at that, because documenting or counting the segment of the population experiencing homelessness is a very complicated count. So you have those individuals who actually live on the street. So we actually have a period of time where we actually go and hire people to count those people who are on the street. We do work with the local communities to identify those areas, however. So you've got that segment of the population. You've got those individuals who are going to be at a soup kitchen or on a bed. So we have to work with that group and again do that count about the very same time. And then you have the other groups that fall into those who are in the hospital or receiving other services that may not have another home. So that's another segment of that count. So we do work with our local complete count committees to identify what are those components. We've actually already been working on that to make sure within our administrative records we know what groups we need to include, what facilities we need to include in that count, and we will be doing a verification of that in January of 2020. Did that help? Okay.
We'll jump back there, and then we'll come to the woman in the stripes up here, and then I've got you if we have enough time. Go ahead.
So I'm super sympathetic to all the arguments here, but as you said, there's no one here sort of representing the other side of this. So just to sort of play devil's advocate for a second, Dr. Murdock said that this will depress turnout, or response rates on the survey, which I definitely buy. Michael said that it could lead to the reduction in 3 additional congressional seats, which is a little bit
Not
more
3, but a portion of 3.
Well,
yeah,
right,
yeah,
exactly,
right,
which is
right.
so sort of specific but more general. But I guess what I wonder is, within the context of all this, as a survey researcher myself, I'm always surprised by how little these external factors ever seem to affect anything internally when I'm actually conducting a survey, different than the census. What sort of, specifically, what sort of reduction in the count do you expect, and based on what, I guess, other than the feeling and sort of the knowledge that this will, generally make people less likely to respond? I mean, I know that if I ask a survey or a citizenship question on any survey, it's absolutely the last question I will ask because I know I'm expecting people to hang up. But I don't know for sure. I don't look at this specifically. So I'm wondering, is there a specific estimate in terms of the reduction in the count that you all are expecting? If so, what is it? If not, is it possible that, sort of the responsive representative here saying, how terrible this is going to be and how communities are not trusting the government and we shouldn't give them this information, is that going to actually further depress response rates to the survey above and beyond the actual question being added?
Who wants to take it?
Well, I do think, I think, and others on this panel can talk more about this. I mean, just asking more questions depress anything. Like, do you like peanut butter? Will depress response rates because I did a survey online for a company that I buy products from, and like it had like 20 questions, and I stopped at about 11, right? Because it was like I don't, this is too many. And so, there is that effect. And, I think it's important to understand that this will affect not only, if you're imagining non-citizens doing this, this will undercount children as well, because like non-citizens have children who are citizens, right? And so, how it exactly plays out, I think a lot of people are still looking at that. To your point about the messaging, yeah, this is like really hard, right? Because we on the one hand have to say this is like terrible, all this terrible stuff is happening, but recognize that saying this is terrible is part of the atmospherics that are there, and so the best argument I've heard from somebody who works with Latino groups is look. The people who added this question are people like Chris Kobach in Kansas, who want this question added are people like Chris Kobach in Kansas, the Trump administration, and so on and so forth. They want you to be invisible. By not participating in the census, you're letting them win. And so I think we have to figure out what the messaging is, and we have to figure it out fast.
Dr. Murdock, I'm sorry.
And that's just so, that's just so bad because for any politician, you can't be good for business and bad for census, right? You can't have that. You have to have good data to make informed decisions on where you're going to create jobs and invest and, the type of infrastructure that is in the community. So these politicians that are using this, in a very negative way to throw red meat at their base, who also, on the other side of their mouth, are claiming that they're pro-business, that's inaccurate. We need to get as much information. We need more people to participate. Like you said, those that have children, to count their children. When the folks are coming, and any given day in El Paso, we've got folks traveling from all over the world coming to El Paso because of trade next to Mexico. And we've got to count all these people that are using our roads, again, you can't be good for business and advocate for a bad census.
To get to your first question, though, I'm wondering, Dr. Murdock, I might put you on the spot here, but is there an easy way to estimate the undercount? And Cathy, this might be something that you can weigh in on too. Is it as easy as taking the current estimates for the undocumented population and their kids and thinking about it that way, or
well,
how
you
do
can
we go?
a variety of ways of doing it. We could spend several days talking about it. But I think the critical thing is, if you're going to do that, is to use the consistent methodology across all areas that you're working with. You can get, I think, if it's systematically done and if it is implemented soon enough. And one of the problems, and I realize it's change of administration, is that a lot of this material was dumped on the Census Bureau with very little time left. And as was done, in fact, to address the needs, the desires of certain people in certain parties. There's no doubt about that. So that I think what all we can do at this point, given where we are, is do our best to ensure that as many people respond to the census as possible, help our colleagues in the census to get the best count they can, but at the same time be looking at something that most demographers have never wanted, and that is that at the end we see how we can adjust the overall census to be more accurate. That's always fearful to some areas that think they're going to lose more if there's an adjustment, that sort of thing. But I think we need to seriously look at that depending on what we find out in the census. If the census looks what we would expect it to be in certain areas, probably we don't have to do as much. But if we look at an area and we say, do we really think that that area lost 50,000 Hispanics? Then we better be saying, well, that's probably not logical. We need to go back and look at some, and census always goes back to certain areas and redoes the work, and make sure that we address that potential problem.
We've got a question up here. Oh, let's move the mic.
For Representative Blanco, you said you approached or you sent a letter to Governor Abbott and you hadn't received a response yet. When did you send the letter, and did you ask for a specific budget for this committee, the Complete Count Committee?
So we didn't ask for a specific budget. We sent the letter as soon as Secretary Ross came out advocating for the citizenship question. We're going to work with the LBB to figure that out. We're going to work with appropriators to figure out what that is. But we've already seen California allocate $90 million toward their Complete Count Committee in the state. We should be competing with that. You know, we stand to gain. Why should we give our congressional seats to California? I don't think Governor Abbott would like that. So, you know, we can correct this, but this shouldn't be a Republican or Democratic issue. This is about our fair share, and that's the argument. So I hope that my brothers and sisters on the other side of the aisle, you know, put some common sense into the census, and get an accurate count of what you know, what we can gain from this. So haven't heard from them yet. I'm hopeful. We saw precedent, as I mentioned earlier. Governor Bush did it. Governor Clements did it. I think we can get back on track and make sure that Texas gets its fair share.
And I will just add on, I have also reached out to the governor's office regarding this and have not heard back. This will be our last question. I'm really sorry for the rest of you who wanted to ask questions. Maybe our panelists might be able to stick around and get to those afterwards. Go ahead.
I'm from New Braunfels, and I'm really excited by what I've heard here. I'm already thinking about how I can work in my community and who are the trusted institutions and people. For example, I think the most popular institution in our community is the library, and that's where many people access computers. So I feel like I need to start right now and educate myself so I can talk to the mayor and the food bank people and so forth. So where can I get information, especially about the online census, you know, how they could go to a remote location and sign in and things like that, so I can begin to educate our librarians so they can be helpful.
All right, so we actually have a Rebecca Briscoe who's in the audience today. She is one of our partnership coordinators. We have Maria Campos, who's also here. She works for the Census Bureau, and we have Rob Taylor in the back. So they're going to be your local people on the ground. We'll be hiring a few more, but they will help you with the material that we currently have to promote those complete count committees and get that local involvement going. Thank you. Absolutely.
Right there.
Right behind you.
Right there.
All done.
Well, on that...
And for Latino communities that don't trust the government, you can go to organizations like NALEO.
Yeah.
That provide good information. It's a trusted source. They've got folks here in Austin. They've got a great guy here in Austin, in San Antonio, and in Houston. But they do a lot of work in the state, and really they're the go-to source for the Latino community for census information. NALEO, National Association of Latino. I'll give you the information.
NALEO.
Actually, I just saw Jose back there who's with NALEO, so we can get you more information. But for the Latino community, that's a good trusted source.
Yeah, very good source.
Well, on that positive note, I think we will come to a close. Thank you all so much for being here. Let's give our panelists a round of applause.